All right, hello and welcome. We are at lesson 7 of Last Epoch University, and this is the first of 2 parts for defenses. It's a very large topic, so we break it up into 2 lessons. And the first one is going to be on HP, ward, sustain, and resistances. Lesson 2 will cover everything else, things like armor, dodge, etc. Okay, let's go ahead though and get into the topics at hand for this lesson. We will start with HP, which is also known as hit points. This is your most basic defense, as it is in most ARPGs, if not all ARPGs, and most RPGs. The more hit points you have, the more damage you can take before dying. So if you have 1,000 HP, you can take a hit of 1,000 or under 1,000, just under 1,000, 199 before you're dead. If you get hit by 1,000 or more, it will kill you. It is effective against all damage because all damage has to affect HP in some way or get mitigated before it reaches HP. But HP is your last line of defense. And high amounts can negatively impact sustain, though, like Leech, Regen, and healing, if your sustain isn't high enough. So there is a downside to having high amounts, although honestly, most of the time you're still going to want high amounts. And you're just going to need to find a good source of sustain that can maintain that high levels of HP. But that is something to keep in mind. If your sustain is relatively low and your HP is relatively high, it may not be as beneficial for you as you'd like because you can't get it back fast enough. All right, ward is a fairly special type of almost hit point. It's like HP for Last Epoch. It is effective against all damage types. It's very similar to PoE's energy shield, except it doesn't have a weakness. There's no type of damage that by default actually goes through ward, so you don't have to worry about being killed by some some damage type that just isn't affected by ward because it doesn't exist in this game. So ward is a very effective layer of defense, a layer of HP that works in all scenarios. You can generate it through multiple sources. For example, ward per second is a stat that you can get. If you have 40 ward per second, you will generate 40 ward per second, similar to HP regen, which we'll talk about soon enough. Ward on hit, you hit the enemy, you get a certain amount of ward. Ward on use, you use a potion or use a skill, and you get a burst of ward. Ward on kill, you kill an enemy, you get ward, etc. You get the idea. Just as an example of what ward can look like, this character here is a ward build. You can see down here, this is the health pool. It only has 41 health, but it has 4,350 ward. How's it doing that? This is what we call a low life build, where we have gear on that reduces our health per second by a percentage of current health, so it never reaches 0, but it goes down to very low. But then also a percentage of our missing health is gained as ward per second, so it's effectively generating ward over time. And in this case, we have 4,350. You might wonder, why don't we have more than 4,350? That seems like a weird number for it to just stop at. The reason is because ward decays over time. The more ward you have, the quicker it decays. And there's a stat called ward retention that slows the decay, that is acquired through passives, gear, skills, and intelligence, but you'll never get to the point to where there is no decay. There always will be decay, which is why, despite the fact that we're gaining a certain amount of ward per second here, we aren't going into infinite numbers of ward. There's a point where the ward decay catches up and it levels out. And it's about 4,350, 4,351 right here. And you can see our ward retention right here. We currently have 236% ward retention on this character, and that's ultimately how we're getting to that much ward. Okay, as far as ward and what is supported on it, I do have this Mage Acolyte have most support. Rogue and Sentinel also have some, and that is definitely true. A lot of support also though comes from gear. Uniques there's a lot of uniques out there that are built for ward. That's actually how this character is doing. How this character is building its ward through uniques and through an experimental affix. Okay. That's enough about ward for now. We'll talk about it a bit, though, while we're talking about the sort of sustain stuff, because it kind of applies to both in certain ways. But sustain, generally, we're talking about ways to replenish hit points after damage has been taken. So you take a hit, you have 1,000 health, you have 500 health. Well, you want to get your health back, right? So how do you do that? Well, you can pop a potion, but that's relatively ineffective under most circumstances. You need enough potions to do it. It's better to have a more consistent source of sustain, and that's where these 4 types of sustain come in. Leech, regeneration, healing, and on action. Things like on hit, on kill, on dodge. Similar to the ward that we're talking about, where you can get ward on hit, ward on kill. You can do the same thing for HP. These are both forms of sustain. One's just ward, one's HP. All right, let's talk about Leech, and then we'll go into regen, healing, on action. After that, Leech is a percentage of damage that you deal is replenished as the player's health. So, for example, you do 1,000 damage, and you have 10% Leech, 10% damage leeched as health, then you will leech back 100 of that as health. Now, this isn't instant. It happens over 3 seconds. So as you're continuing to hit enemies, though, you're continuing to build more leech, and you'll have a large amount of leech if you're in a fight where you're doing lots of damage. It's very strong in high damage builds or with high percent leech. It can also leech dots, but be aware of the leech type. So not all leech applies to all types. So if it says melee damage, leech as health, well, your dots aren't going to count. If it just says some sort of generic leech, then it probably will. There's damage over time leech as health. So be aware of the type of leech it is, or else it might not work for your build. A good example of this is there's a pair of gloves that you can get, Avarice gloves, very early in the game. They're a guaranteed drop on a side quest if you choose the right person, and they leech back a percentage of your elemental damage. Well, if you don't have elemental damage, they're not doing anything for you, so make sure that if you're trying to take advantage of the leech on those gloves, you are doing elemental damage. Okay, here's some easy sources of leech. I already mentioned the Avarice gloves, which are an easy source if you are doing elemental damage. Bleeding Heart is a common drop unique that will work for, honestly, any type of damage, but spells have a significant drawback, but it's especially good for non-spells. Spells will cause you to bleed. There is actually a couple of builds for mage that will still take advantage of this because they can cleanse the bleed, but usually this is going to be used for non-spell builds. Crafted gloves or weapons can put melee damage leeches health as an affix on them. And then every class has some sort of combination of passive and skills that can leech, so every class can have access to it if that's the route you want to go. All right, let's move on from leech to regen and healing. Regeneration is just amount of HP per second, so we can look at this character and see where the HP per second is. It has 20 health regen per second, which is actually why it still has 41 health. Otherwise, it'd have like 1 health. Because of the gear it's wearing, but it has 41 because of that. If I took off my ward gear, in fact, let's do that. You can see that I start to build up my health because of that. That's just that 20 health per second that I have on. Of course, I'm losing my ward because, well, I have no way to generate it now because I took my gear off. But oops, don't want to do that. There we go, and there we go. Okay. How much regen you have is determined by your base regen and your increased regen. So every character starts with a base level of regen that can be added to through gear. You can add base regen on areas like boots, gloves, helmet. I think there are some other areas. There are definitely some uniques that can do it, and you can do it through some passives. So this is how you build the base part, and then the increased regen is in a multiplier on top of it. So if you have 10 base regen and 100% increased regen, you double it to 20. Both can be improved through various sources, both for gear and through passives, etc. It is possible to reach hundreds per second of HP per second. On ward, currently, pre 1.0, it's possible to reach thousands. Whether that's true 1.0 or not is impossible to say at the moment, but that's something to keep an eye on. But right now, ward can regen a lot based upon its version of this. It currently tends to be weaker than leech for similar investment in most builds. This applies to HP, not to ward. Ward has shifted throughout the development of the game, and I imagine will continue to shift. But at least at the moment, the way that HP works, the vast majority of builds that are HP builds are better off running leech. At least pre 1.0. There's something could change for 1.0, but pre 1.0, that's how it currently works. As far as healing goes, this is another option that you have for sustain. This is HP restored on a heal. Usually it's instant, but it can be hot. This is usually found in skills. There are other forms of healing, but generally it's a skill that you're actually choosing to use actively, and then it heals you. Healing effectiveness can increase how much healing you have. So if a skill heals you for 70 HP, and you have 100% increased healing effectiveness on gear or passives or a buff from the skills, then you get 140 per heal. The strength of healing is largely skill dependent. There are some skills that do a lot of healing, are very, very powerful for healing. And then there are some skills that are just not very good at it. So healing can be a late game option. It just depends. All right, the last one for sustain we'll talk about is on action. This is I do something and I gain health. It's similar mechanically to healing, but is not affected by healing effectiveness, so is not technically healing. Some notable examples of this kind of thing: Rogue has sapping strikes and draining arrows, which we'll show you here. I'm not using these on this build, but they are on their passive tree. So sapping strikes gives you, with 4-point investment, 16 health per skill use if the skill costs 0 mana. And then draining arrows gives you another 40 on top of that, so 56 total. So every time you use a bow attack and hit at least one enemy, and that hit is 0, you get a total of 56 health. This is enough in some high attack speed builds for Rogue to be its primary sustain. Doesn't need any more than that, so it can be very effective. Sentinel has some stuff like Time and Faith. Time and Faith is actually similar to Sapping Strikes. And then there's health on hit and health on kill on weapons that you can get. So health on hit in particular is very powerful early game. It tends to fall off a lot late game, but early game it's very, very good. Okay, let's move on from sustain and HP, and let's talk about resistances. This is a important topic because resistances are almost always important in games, and this is actually geared towards PoE, but I'll also talk about Diablo 4, because Diablo 4 actually works very similar to PoE with a notable exception, which is the cap that you can have baseline. But that's not going to matter too much. We're going to compare it mostly to PoE because they both cap at 75 baseline. Just know that D4 works similarly to PoE in this regard. It just can't go as high. Okay, so resistances provide protection against the corresponding damage type. So if you have physical resistance, you get some sort of damage reduction from physical attacks. This is both hits and it's dots. So if you have a bleed on you and you have physical resistance, you will take less damage than if you didn't have any physical resistance. In this game, it caps at 75%. You can go over, but it won't do you any good baseline. But if you get a shred on you, which reduces the amount of resistance you have, and you're capped, then you can prevent yourself from going under the cap. So there is some protection or some advantage of going over 75%. Although typically we don't really prioritize that in the game. It is generally encouraged to cap resistances somewhere by early to mid mono and then beyond. This is usually pretty good for most players because it will make it just easier to progress through the game and not take too much damage. All classes specialize in resistance in some sort of way. Like the mages have elemental resistance passives, the rogue has poison resistance, sentinel has a bunch, including necrotic, void, physical, element. It's got pretty much everything. But they all have something in there, usually in their passive tree, but even in some of their active skills. Okay, now here's where this game deviates from other games that use resistances. In other games, your resistance is what your resistance is, right? If you have 75% physical resistance, then you take 75% less damage baseline just because of your resistance from the enemies. That's not the case in Last Epoch. So enemies gain 1% resistance penetration up to level 75. So by level 75, they have 75% penetration. And by level 100, they also have 75% penetration. At level 25, they have 25% penetration. So this is going to think something that goes up as you continue to move farther into area levels. So it's not connected to your level, but the levels of the enemies. Resistances can go negative in this game, causing you to take more damage, which means that if you don't get any resistances, you will take additional damage as the penetration ramps up. So in level 1, you take 100 damage hit, you have 0% resistances, it's 100 damage. At level 75, that same 100 damage hit with no resistances is actually 175 damage, so it's significantly more. At level 1, though, if you had a 75% resistances for that 100 damage, you would have 25 damage. This is almost impossible, by the way, to get 75% resistance at level 1. It technically is possible, not for a fresh character on a fresh account, but you can do it through special leveling items. But typically you wouldn't see this. But if you did, you take dramatically less damage. At level 75 with 100 damage hits, though, you'd be back to your baseline 100 damage from that level 1. See, because of the penetration, it's effectively sort of removing your resistances, quote unquote, to bring you back to baseline. But if you didn't have those, you'd take more damage. So you definitely still want your resistances in this case. And you compare this to PoE. 100 damage hit at your capped resistances, no matter what level it is, well, that's 25 damage because it's 75% damage reduction. Okay, so what does this actually mean for you and for gearing resistances? This means that in PoE, when you have 75% resistance, you have 75% damage reduction. Also, Diablo 4, it caps at 70%, so you have 70% damage reduction. But in Last Epoch, 75% resistance actually means 42.8% damage reduction. Because, again, it's taking from, it's 100 damage hit, but it's 175 if you have no resistances, and it's then 100 damage if you have resistances. So it's a significantly less damage reduction than if it was just a pure, there's no penetration, you just have 75% resistance damage reduction to whatever the hit is. So, for example, versus 100 damage in PoE, you had 74%. Let's actually contextualize what this is here. So, how does this affect how powerful each percentage of damage reduction, or excuse me, not damage, resistance is? That's what we want to contextualize in this next part. So, we take a 100 damage hit in PoE, we have 74% resistance. We take 26 damage. If we have 75% resistance, we take 25 damage. That's a difference of 3.8% damage. So it's a 3.8% damage reduction going from 74 to 75. This is why people tell you that capping your resistance in PoE is so important, because the closer you get to 100%, which would make you immune, the more powerful each point is. In Last Epoch, though, if you go from 74%, you take 101 damage, and 75%, you take 100 damage, which is a difference of 1%. It's very flat. Every percent at 75 is worth 1% damage reduction. This will be true whether it's the first percent of resistance you take or the 75th percent of resistance you take. The conclusion from this you should take, this may seem complicated, but really the conclusion is that capping resistance in PoE is more important than LE. Last Epoch is not as strong of a factor in whether you're going to survive or not. With that being said, you should still strive to cap or be close to an LE, because 42.8% damage reduction is still a lot of damage reduction. So you still want that. If you're at 0% resistance, you're probably going to be in trouble. You're probably going to die a lot. But if you're only at 72 or 73% or even 68% resistance, you're fine. It's not the end of the world if you don't have that last bit. You want it, but you don't have to be as worried about it as you might be in PoE if you're coming from that. All right, that wraps up all of this lesson, but we still have lesson 2, which is going to cover a lot of topics on defense. Like I mentioned, armor, dodge, block. There's a bunch of things in there, so you're definitely going to want to check that out. Also, if you want a really sizable written breakdown, just a really large article that gives you all of the defenses that you can keep going back to over and over again, and just pretty much get any information that you could want on how defenses work, I have a guide on Maxroll called Defenses Explained. Please do check that out, and feel free to ask me any questions you have both on that and on this guide. I'm happy to answer those. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great time in Last Epoch. Part 2 coming up real soon. Check that out, and I'll see you all again real soon.